The soft hum of the ceiling fan echoed through the nearly empty classroom as evening shadows stretched across the walls. The school day had ended hours ago, but the quiet room still carried the faint scent of chalk and paper. Mr. Daniel sat alone at his wooden desk, surrounded by stacks of test papers. His glasses slipped slightly down his nose as he leaned forward, marking answers with slow, careful strokes of his pen. Outside, the sun dipped behind the old school building, turning the sky a soft orange. The distant laughter of a few students faded down the hallway, leaving behind only silence. For most teachers, grading exams was the least favorite part of the job, but for him it was almost peaceful. Each paper felt like a small window into his students' minds. He always said that reading their answers was like listening to their thoughts. Some wrote carefully, afraid to make a mistake. Others wrote quickly as if racing time, and then there were a few who poured their hearts into every word. Those were the students who reminded him why he loved teaching. That night, however, felt heavier than usual. The end of the semester was always tiring, and he was beginning to feel the weight of it. He stretched his back and sighed softly before picking up another bundle of papers. The stack was thick, filled with test sheets from his senior literature class. He began flipping through them one by one, marking, noting, and circling where needed. Then, somewhere near the bottom of the pile, something made him pause. He noticed a paper that looked slightly different. The handwriting was neat, precise, and strangely familiar. The name written in the top corner made his breath catch in his throat. He blinked, thinking he must be mistaken. But there it was, clearly written in blue ink. Liam Carter. The pen slipped slightly from his hand. For a moment, everything went quiet. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than before. He read the name again. It couldn't be possible. Liam had been one of his brightest students, kind, curious, and always smiling. But Liam had died almost 2 years ago in a car accident. Mr. Daniel stared at the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. He whispered the name under his breath as if saying it aloud would somehow make sense of it. But the classroom stayed still, filled only with the faint rustle of the test papers. He looked closer, comparing it to the others. The ink, the handwriting, the small way Liam used to loop the letter L, it was all the same. He turned the paper over, hoping to find some clue that might explain it. Maybe one of the students played a trick. Maybe someone accidentally submitted an old paper. But no, the questions on the test were brand new, written just a week ago. He rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. The school hallway outside was dark now, the lights flickering faintly. He could hear the janitor sweeping somewhere in the distance. He thought about leaving, but something made him stay. He turned the paper over again and began to read through the answers. Each sentence carried the same careful thought that Liam always used to show in his work. The handwriting flowed naturally, confident, almost too perfect to be forged. As he reached the final page, he saw something that made his heart race. At the bottom of the sheet, right under the last answer, were words written in smaller handwriting. It wasn't part of the test. It was a short message. "Thank you for not forgetting me, sir. I finished what I started." The pen in his hand dropped onto the desk. His chest tightened. The air in the room felt suddenly colder. He stared at the words again and again as if they might change. But they didn't. He sat there for a long moment, frozen in disbelief. The message felt personal, almost like Liam himself had written it. But how could that be? Mr. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and looked around the empty classroom. The last rays of sunlight were fading from the window, and everything outside had turned quiet and dark. He whispered to himself, "This must be a mistake." Trying to calm down, he gathered the paper with the others, slid it into his briefcase, and locked the classroom door behind him. As he walked down the long corridor, his footsteps echoed softly. The school always had an eerie silence after sunset, the kind of stillness that made even the smallest sound seem loud. On his way out, he passed by the wall where the school had once hung a photo of Liam's graduating class. His eyes glanced toward the familiar, smiling face in the picture. He stopped for a moment, staring at it. It was strange, and that same smile, that same spark. He felt a chill run down his spine. When he reached his car, he sat quietly for a few minutes before driving home. The city lights flickered outside the window as he replayed the moment over and over in his mind. How could a student who had been gone for 2 years turn in a test paper? At home, he placed the paper on his dining table, still unsure what to do with it. He poured himself a cup of tea and tried to think rationally. Maybe another student had used the same name as a joke. Maybe it was an old paper someone slipped into the pile by accident. But the more he thought about it, the less sense it made. Liam's handwriting had been unique. He had graded hundreds of papers over the years, but he could always recognize that particular way the letters leaned slightly to the right. There was no mistaking it. That night, Mr. Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept getting up to look at the paper again, hoping to notice something he had missed. But every time he looked at it, the words seemed more real. He even checked the class attendance sheets and exam lists again. But Liam's name wasn't there. There was no record of anyone by that name taking the test. Around midnight, he decided to stop trying to make sense of it. He carefully folded the paper and placed it inside one of his old folders. Still, a small part of him couldn't ignore the strange comfort he felt reading those words. "Thank you for not forgetting me." It almost felt like Liam was reaching out, reminding him of something deeper than grades and lessons. The next morning, Mr. Daniel walked into the staff room earlier than usual. He placed his briefcase on the table and took out the mysterious test paper again. He wanted to show it to someone, but stopped himself. How could he explain this without sounding ridiculous? When the bell rang and students began filling the hallways, he glanced into his classroom. The seat near the window, the one where Liam used to sit, and was empty now. The sunlight fell gently across it, dust floating through the warm air. For a second, it almost felt like he could see Liam sitting there again, resting his chin on his hand, smiling faintly the way he used to. He shook his head and looked away. Maybe his mind was just tired. Maybe the stress of grading had played tricks on him. Later that day, while walking past the classroom after lunch, he paused again near that same window. The wind had blown the curtain slightly and sunlight danced across the desk. For a moment, he thought he saw something. The faint outline of handwriting on the tabletop, just like Liam's doodles he used to draw when he was lost in thought, but when he blinked, it was gone. That evening, Mr. Daniel sat in his car before heading home, staring at the school building through the windshield. He remembered how Liam had once told him that he wanted to be a writer, that he believed words could live forever if someone remembered them. Maybe that's why the paper felt so haunting. It wasn't just about the test. It was about being remembered. When he reached home, he opened his briefcase and took the test paper out again. The handwriting looked softer under the warm lamplight, almost peaceful. He didn't know what it meant or how it had appeared, but he couldn't deny how real it felt. Before going to bed, he whispered quietly to the empty room, as if speaking to someone who might still be listening. "I never forgot you, Liam," he said softly. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, brushing against the window. Somewhere in that quiet night, it almost sounded like a faint reply, like a soft voice carried by the air, saying thank you. Mr. Daniel sat there for a long time, his eyes resting on the paper, unsure if what he was feeling was fear or peace. All he knew was that the classroom would never feel the same again. Something unseen had crossed the line between memory and reality, and it had left behind one message, written in blue ink that he would never forget. The next morning began like any other, yet something in the air felt slightly heavier. The sky outside was pale with a hint of gray, and the soft sound of rain tapped gently against the classroom windows. Mr. Daniel walked into the building with his usual cup of coffee, but his mind was far from calm. The mysterious paper from last night still lingered in his thoughts like an unfinished sentence. He tried to act normal, greeting a few students in the hallway, nodding to fellow teachers, but his focus kept drifting. When he unlocked his classroom door, the familiar smell of chalk and floor polish filled the room. He placed his briefcase on the desk and looked around quietly. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The chairs neatly arranged, the blackboard wiped clean, and the seat by the window, Liam's old seat, empty as always. For a long moment he just stood there staring at that desk. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft lines across the wooden surface. It was strange how that one spot in the room could hold so much memory. He sat down, opened his briefcase, and carefully took out the test paper again. The handwriting looked as real as it did the night before. Every curve, every word seemed alive. He ran his finger lightly across the name at the top. Liam Carter. He let out a small breath and whispered, "How is this possible?" He decided to bring the paper to the school office. Maybe there was a logical explanation, something simple he had overlooked. He slid the paper into a folder and made his way down the hallway. The office was filled with the usual morning noise, phones ringing, teachers signing forms, students handing in assignments. He waited patiently for the vice principal, Mrs. Reed, to finish a phone call before approaching her desk. "Mrs. Reed," he began softly, "I need to ask you about something odd that came up during grading." She smiled politely. "Of course, Mr. Daniel, what's the issue?" He placed the paper gently in front of her. "Do you recognize this name?" She glanced down, adjusting her glasses. "Liam Carter?" She read aloud. Then she looked up, a faint confusion in her eyes. "Wasn't he—" "Yes," he interrupted quietly. "He was my student 2 years ago." She frowned slightly, flipping through the paper. "Where did you get this?" "It was in the pile of test papers from the senior class exam yesterday." Mrs. Reed's eyes widened slightly. "That can't be right. He's not on any list." "I know," Mr. Daniel said, his voice low. "But the handwriting, it's his. I'd recognize it anywhere." She examined the sheet more closely. "Could a student have used his name as a prank?" "That's what I thought," he admitted. "But look at the answers. The details. It's too personal. And the last line." Mrs. Reed read the final words silently. Her expression changed, first confusion, then something softer, almost unsettled. "This is strange," she whispered. She called over the class monitor, a polite girl named Hannah, who handled attendance during the test. "Hannah," Mrs. Reed asked gently, "did anyone by this name hand in a paper during the exam?" The girl shook her head immediately. "No, ma'am. I collected all the tests myself. Seat 17 was empty that day." Mr. Daniel froze. "Seat 17, Liam's old spot," Hannah continued. "I even remember it clearly because we didn't have a full class. There were 24 students instead of 25. Mr. Daniel exchanged a quiet glance with Mrs. Reed. No, one could explain how that paper had appeared. He left the office with the paper still in his hands. The corridor felt colder than before. The sound of students chatting nearby seemed distant. Something inside him whispered that this wasn't just an accident. Later that afternoon, during his free period, he sat alone in the classroom again. Rain was still falling outside, the steady rhythm mixing with the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. He placed the paper on the desk and stared at it, trying to find courage to read it again. He began tracing the answers slowly, word by word. Every line carried a tone that reminded him of Liam's old essays. Thoughtful, curious, a little poetic. It wasn't just similar, it was exact. Then he noticed something else. In one of the short answers, Liam had written a phrase Mr. Daniel used to say in class. "Every story waits for someone to finish it." He remembered that line well. It was something he had told Liam personally after the boy once stayed behind to discuss a novel. The memory hit him hard. That day, Liam had stayed after class, sitting by the window seat, asking about how writers find meaning in endings. Mr. Daniel had smiled and told him that sometimes endings aren't written by the people who start them. That was one of their last conversations. He leaned back, staring at the paper with heavy eyes. Maybe it wasn't about logic anymore. Maybe it was something else. That evening, as the rain continued to pour, he decided to visit someone who might help him understand, the person who knew Liam better than anyone, his mother. He hadn't visited her since the funeral. Time had passed, but he still remembered the sorrow in her eyes. After school, he drove through the narrow streets until he reached a small white house at the end of the road. The lights inside glowed softly through the rain. When she opened the door, surprise crossed her face. "Mr. Daniel?" "Hello," he said gently. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she replied kindly, stepping aside. "Please, come in." The house was quiet and filled with memories. Family photos on the walls, a bookshelf filled with novels, and a few of Liam's old drawings pinned near the kitchen. She offered him tea, and they sat across from each other at the small table. For a while they talked about ordinary things, how the school was doing, how her health was. But then slowly he brought up the reason for his visit. "I found something strange," he said softly, taking out the folder. "I thought you should see it." She looked at the paper for a long time before speaking. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the name at the top. This is Liam's handwriting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But how?" That's what I've been trying to figure out, he replied. It appeared in my pile of test papers yesterday. Tears welled in her eyes as she read the last line. Thank you for not forgetting me, sir. I finished what I started. She pressed her hand to her mouth, silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice broke a little. You know, he always talked about you. He used to say you were the first teacher who believed in him. Mr. Daniel looked down, his heart heavy. He was special. I still think about him often. She stood up and walked to a small shelf. From it, she pulled an old notebook, faded, the edges worn. He used to write stories in this, she said softly, handing it to him. I couldn't bring myself to read the last few pages. Maybe you should. He opened the notebook carefully. Liam's handwriting danced across the pages. Short stories, notes, sketches. Then near the end, he saw something that made him freeze. It was a small paragraph written just days before the accident. It read, If I could ever take one more test, I'd want it to be in Mr. Daniel's class. Maybe then he'd know I listened. Maybe then I'd finally finish what I started. Mr. Daniel closed the notebook slowly. His eyes filled with emotion. He didn't know what to say. There was a strange peace mixed with sorrow in the room, as if some invisible thread had just been tied between them again. When he left the house, the rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to clear. He stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the cool air. The paper in his hand felt lighter somehow, no longer as frightening as before. Driving home, he kept thinking about those words. Finish what I started. Maybe the paper wasn't meant to scare him. Maybe it was meant to tell him something. That night, as he sat at his desk, the paper lay in front of him under the warm glow of a lamp. The handwriting seemed softer, almost peaceful. He realized it wasn't about the test anymore. It was about remembrance, about unfinished things finding their way back to where they belonged. He whispered quietly, Maybe you did finish it, Liam. And somewhere deep inside, he felt a calmness he hadn't felt in years. The next few days passed quietly, but the strange discovery refused to leave Mr. Daniel's mind. The test paper lay inside his desk drawer, neatly folded, yet it seemed to whisper to him every time he opened it. The more he tried to ignore it, the more restless he felt. He told no one else about it, not even his closest colleagues. He didn't want to sound like he was losing his grip on reality. But deep inside, he knew something about that paper wasn't ordinary. It wasn't just about handwriting or coincidence. It carried something deeper, something that felt alive. Every morning when he entered his classroom, his eyes would automatically fall on the seat by the window, seat number 17. It had been empty since the semester began, and now it felt even emptier. The sunlight that touched that corner every morning reminded him of Liam, the boy who used to sit there, quietly listening, always with that slight, curious smile. One afternoon after his last class, he found himself standing near that seat. The room was silent, the students gone. Dust particles floated in the golden light coming through the window. He ran his hand gently over the desk surface. It was smooth except for faint marks, small scratches that looked almost like letters. He leaned closer. Maybe it was just an old carving from years ago, but one line stood out. Keep learning. He remembered saying those exact words to Liam once after class. The boy had been struggling with an essay, and Mr. Daniel had told him, Don't chase perfection. Just keep learning. A chill passed through him. He pulled his hand back slowly and looked around the room. The air felt still, heavier than before. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the desk, about the message, about the test paper. He decided he needed answers, even if it meant facing the possibility that there weren't any. He went back to the school late in the evening after most of the teachers had left. The halls were quiet. The flickering lights above gave off a faint hum. He unlocked his classroom and stepped inside. The air was cool, almost cold. He walked to his desk, switched on the small lamp, and pulled out the test paper again. The handwriting looked so clear under the light. Every line felt intentional. He whispered to himself, If someone is trying to tell me something, what is it? The silence in the room deepened. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the window pane. Suddenly, he heard something faint, the soft sound of paper rustling. He turned sharply, but the room was empty. He waited, holding his breath, listening. Then he realized it was coming from the desk near the window, Liam's old seat. He walked slowly toward it, each step echoing softly on the floor. There on the desk lay a single sheet of blank paper. He was sure he hadn't left anything there before. He stared at it for a long moment, his heart pounding. Then, without thinking, he reached out and picked it up. It was just an ordinary piece of paper. Nothing written, nothing strange. Yet when he turned it under the light, he could faintly see impressions, as if someone had written on it recently. The marks were shallow, almost invisible. He tilted it again, and slowly a few words appeared. "You believed in me." He stepped back, his hands trembling. It wasn't fear that filled him. It was something else. A mix of sadness and warmth, like a memory trying to reach through time. The next morning, he went to the school office again, hoping to find some logical explanation. Perhaps an old batch of unused paper, something connected to a printing mix-up. But the clerk in charge of supplies looked puzzled. "We haven't used that exam format in 2 years, she said. 2 years. The same amount of time since Liam's death. When Mr. Daniel walked out of the office, he felt lightheaded. Nothing made sense, and yet everything felt connected. Over the next week, small things began to happen. Once, when he was grading papers after school, he noticed a soft scent in the air, faintly like the cologne Liam used to wear. Another day, while arranging the bookshelf, a notebook fell open on the floor. The page it landed on had a quote he'd written on the blackboard long ago. "Learning never ends." He sat down, staring at the open book, and whispered, "What are you trying to tell me, Liam?" That night he couldn't stay still. He went through old class files, exam lists, even photographs from past years. He found a photo of his literature class from the year Liam was in it. In the picture, everyone smiled brightly. Liam was standing at the back, holding his paper proudly. Mr. Daniel traced the outline of the boy's face with his eyes. He remembered how Liam had once stayed behind after class to show him a short story he wrote about a student who found a letter from someone long gone. It was a story about unfinished words, about memories that refused to fade. He'd laughed at the time, telling Liam that his imagination was far beyond his years. Now, sitting alone in his living room, he wasn't so sure it was just imagination. Days passed, and the tension inside him grew heavier. He stopped sleeping properly. His colleagues started noticing his tired eyes and distracted behavior. When asked if he was okay, he'd just smile weakly and say, "Just tired." But one evening, something shifted. He was grading papers again when the lights in the classroom flickered. The faint hum of the fan stopped for a second, then started again. At that same moment, a page from his desk fluttered to the floor. He bent down to pick it up. It wasn't a paper from the current class. It was an old essay written in the same handwriting as the mysterious test paper. He didn't remember putting it there. The essay's title read, "A Lesson That Never Ends." It was one of Liam's old assignments. The words on the page were hauntingly familiar. The essay talked about how knowledge never truly disappears, that when someone teaches with kindness, their lessons live on in the hearts of others. At the bottom of the essay was a line that made Mr. Daniel's chest tighten. "Even if I'm not there, I hope my teacher knows I'm still learning." He closed his eyes. The emotions he had been holding back finally spilled over. He realized he had been carrying guilt for 2 years. Guilt for not being able to help a student who had gone too soon. Maybe that paper, that handwriting, those messages were never meant to frighten him. Maybe they were meant to heal something inside him. The next morning, he visited the small memorial garden behind the school, where a tree had been planted in memory of students who had passed away. Liam's name was carved gently on one of the plaques. He stood there quietly, the morning breeze brushing against his face. "I don't know if this is real or just my heart trying to find peace," he whispered. "But if you can hear me, Liam, thank you for coming back. You reminded me what it means to teach." A leaf drifted down from the tree and landed softly at his feet. He smiled faintly, unsure if it was just coincidence or something more. That evening, when he returned to his classroom, the atmosphere felt different, lighter, almost serene. He sat at his desk, pulled out the mysterious test paper once more, and noticed something new he hadn't seen before. In the faint light near the edge of the page, almost hidden in the margin, were 2 tiny words written so lightly that they seemed invisible at first glance. "Thank you." He smiled for the first time in days. He didn't need to understand how it happened anymore. Some things in life weren't meant to be explained. They were meant to be felt. From that day on, whenever he taught his students, he spoke with more warmth, more patience. He often told them stories about learning, about kindness, about how one person's words can echo far beyond their time. And every time he looked at seat number 17, he felt a quiet comfort, as if in some small way. It wasn't empty at all. The morning sun spilled softly through the classroom windows, painting golden shapes on the floor. For the first time in weeks, the room didn't feel heavy. The air was still, calm, peaceful, almost as if the walls themselves had taken a deep breath. Mr. Daniel entered quietly, carrying his usual folder of lessons. But hidden inside it, folded carefully, was the same test paper that had changed everything. He still couldn't bring himself to leave it at home. It had become something more than just paper and ink. It felt like a bridge between the past and the present, between him and a student who somehow hadn't completely gone. He sat down and looked around the classroom. The students had begun to fill their seats, laughing and chatting before class started. Their voices were light, their energy easy. It was a normal day, but in his heart, he knew something had shifted forever. When the bell rang, he stood up and smiled at them. "All right, everyone," he said, his tone warm. "Before we begin today's lesson, I want to tell you a story." The students leaned forward, curious. He didn't mention names. He just spoke softly about a student who once sat in this same room, a boy who loved learning, who asked questions that made even the teacher think harder. A student who taught him that knowledge isn't just about books or exams, but about the way we touch lives. He didn't tell them about the paper. That part he kept close to his heart. After class, when the room was empty again, he stayed behind for a while. The chair by the window, seat 17, caught the sunlight perfectly. He walked over, rested his hand on the back of it, and closed his eyes for a brief moment. That night, as he was organizing old school records in the staff room, he found something unexpected. It was a thin, dust-covered box at the bottom of the archive cabinet. The label on top said Year 20 Literature Projects. He opened it slowly, coughing slightly as a puff of dust rose in the air. Inside were folders, each belonging to a different student. Near the bottom, he found one labeled Liam Carter. He froze. Carefully, he pulled it out. The folder was light, worn, and slightly yellowed with time. Inside were essays, a few notes, and a project Liam had never finished. The title page read, Stories That Stay. He remembered assigning that project. It had been a final year task. Students were supposed to write about stories that had changed their lives. Liam had started his, but never completed it. Mr. Daniel sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages. Liam's words were honest and full of feeling, describing how stories could keep people alive in memory. He had written, "If people are remembered, they never really go away. Their words stay." At the bottom of the last written page, right before it ended mid-sentence, were faint pencil marks. Someone, maybe Liam, maybe someone else, had begun to write something more. The words were hard to read, but after squinting under the light, he finally made them out. "I'll finish this one day." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the line. Everything suddenly felt connected. The paper, the seat, the words, finish what I started. It wasn't a coincidence. He thought about what Liam had left behind, the essay, the stories, the lessons. Maybe this was what finishing meant. Not coming back from the past, but reminding someone that the bond between a teacher and a student never disappears. He looked at the folder again, and for the first time, he noticed something else tucked between the pages, a small piece of blue paper folded carefully. He unfolded it slowly. It was a note, short and simple. It said, "One day I'll write something that makes you proud." Mr. Daniel couldn't help but smile, even as tears filled his eyes. He whispered, "You already did." That night he carried the folder home with him. He placed it on his desk beside the mysterious test paper. The two pieces of work, one unfinished, one impossible, sat side by side, as if they had been waiting all along to be reunited. He spent hours reading through everything Liam had written. Every sentence seemed to speak directly to him, like a quiet conversation across time. At one point, he even caught himself laughing softly at one of Liam's old jokes scribbled in the margin. "If I ever become a writer, you'll be my first editor." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Maybe that was the revelation, that connections like these don't end with time. They shift, they echo, but they remain. The next morning, Mr. Daniel arrived at school early. The corridors were silent, the air still cool from the morning breeze. He went straight to his classroom and opened the window beside seat 17. The sky outside was bright and full of soft light. He placed both papers and the test and the unfinished essay, side by side on the desk. For a few moments, he just looked at them. Then slowly, he took out his pen and wrote a single sentence on the bottom of the essay page. Just below where Liam had stopped writing, he wrote, "You finished it, Liam." He placed the pen down and smiled quietly. There was no need for fear or mystery anymore. The message had been received. Later that week, the school hosted its annual literature exhibition, a small event where students displayed essays, poems, and stories inspired by past alumni. Mr. Daniel decided to include one special piece, Liam's unfinished project, titled Stories That Stay. He printed a short note to place beside it. It read, "This story was written by a student who reminded me that lessons never end. Some words stay alive long after they're written." When the students came to see the display, many stopped at that table reading quietly. They didn't know the full story, but they felt something in those words. Something genuine, lasting. That evening, as the event ended, Mr. Daniel stood by the window of his classroom once more. The lights of the school courtyard shimmered below. He could hear faint laughter from students heading home. He turned toward seat 17, half expecting to see it empty as always. But just for a moment, just a flicker, it felt like someone was there. A familiar shape, faint in the warm light, sitting by the window, head bent over a paper, writing slowly with a blue pen. Mr. Daniel didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply watched, his heart calm, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the image faded into the evening light. He let out a slow breath and smiled. "Good work, Liam," he whispered. As he gathered his things to leave, he turned off the lights, leaving the classroom bathed in soft sunset glow. The papers on the desk fluttered slightly from the open window, just a small movement, like a final nod of farewell. Outside, the sky was filled with golden clouds. Birds flew overhead as the day slowly turned to dusk. For the first time in years, Mr. Daniel felt at peace. When he reached his car, he paused and looked back at the school building one last time. The window of his classroom reflected the orange light of the setting sun, shining brighter than the rest. The same window where Liam had once sat, where a mysterious paper had appeared, and where a teacher's heart had learned that some stories never truly end. He smiled softly, whispering to himself, maybe that's what teaching really is, helping someone's story stay alive. And with that thought, he got in his car and drove away, feeling lighter than he had in a long, long time. Inside the empty classroom, the papers on the desk rustled one last time as the wind moved through the open window. The test paper lay still, its ink fading gently in the warm light. But the words on it, those simple words, "Thank you for not forgetting me," would stay forever. Days turned into weeks, and life at the school slowly found its rhythm again. The laughter in the hallways, the rustle of notebooks, the sound of chalk against the board, everything seemed to return to normal. But for Mr. Daniel, nothing was quite the same. Something inside him had changed, quietly, deeply, in a way words could never fully explain. Every morning, he would open the classroom windows a little wider, letting in more sunlight and fresh air. He said it made the students think better, but deep down he knew it was his way of keeping the room open, as if inviting something unseen to stay. Seat 17 remained part of his classroom. He never reassigned it, even when new students joined mid-year. When asked why, he would simply smile and say, "That one's taken." No one questioned him. Somehow everyone respected it, as if they too could sense that the seat carried a story that didn't need to be told out loud. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The trees outside the classroom went from green to gold, from gold to bare, and then bloomed again. The school year ended and another began. Time kept moving as it always did, but the memory of what had happened stayed quietly alive. Not haunting, just present like a soft hum in the background of every day. One winter morning, Mr. Daniel received a letter. It was from the city's education board, inviting him to a regional teachers' conference. He didn't think much of it at first, but then noticed a line at the bottom of the letter. "You've been nominated for the Lifetime Educators Award." He sat for a long time with the letter in his hands, reading that sentence again and again. It wasn't about fame or recognition. He didn't even know who had nominated him. But something about it made him feel that maybe, in some way, all the moments of quiet care, all the patience, all the unseen work, had finally reached somewhere beyond his classroom walls. At the conference, surrounded by hundreds of teachers from different schools, he felt humbled. He listened to speeches about innovation, leadership, and technology. But when it was his turn to speak briefly, he set his prepared notes aside and spoke from the heart. "I've been teaching for more than 30 years, he began softly, "and I've learned that the most powerful lessons we teach are not in textbooks. Sometimes they're in the moments we don't even realize are lessons. A word of encouragement, a small act of kindness, a belief that someone can do better. We never truly know how far those moments travel." He paused, taking a quiet breath. "A few years ago, I found a test paper that shouldn't have existed. It reminded me that the connections we make and the care we give don't end with time. They stay in ways we can't explain." He didn't give details, but his voice carried something real, something everyone in the room could feel. When he finished, there was silence followed by gentle applause, not the loud kind, but the kind that comes from people who understand. That night, as he returned home, the air was crisp and full of winter stars. He looked up at the sky and thought about all his students over the years. The ones who succeeded, the ones who struggled, the ones who had quietly slipped out of his life. And of course, he thought about Liam. When he reached home, he walked into his study. On the wall above his desk hung the framed essay titled "Stories That Stay." Below it, on the shelf, rested the test paper, carefully preserved between two sheets of glass, the handwriting still clear under the soft lamplight. He often looked at it when he needed to remember why he taught. It wasn't for the curriculum or the grades. It was for those small, invisible moments when a teacher and a student understood each other, when learning became something human, not mechanical. That winter evening, he sat by his window with a cup of tea, watching the snow fall outside. The world was quiet. And then faintly he heard a knock. It wasn't from the door. It was from his study window, soft, almost like the sound of snow tapping the glass. He turned his head. For just a moment he saw a blur. A boy's silhouette, faint and smiling, framed by falling snowflakes. It wasn't frightening. It wasn't strange. It just was. A gentle presence, calm and familiar. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. He simply whispered, "You kept your promise," and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the silhouette faded back into the night, leaving only the quiet dance of snow outside. He smiled, feeling warmth spread through his chest. It was enough. Years passed after that. Mr. Daniel eventually retired, though the school often invited him back to mentor younger teachers. The new staff respected him deeply, not because of awards or years of service, but because of the way he spoke about teaching as something sacred. He still visited his old classroom sometimes. The school had changed, new desks, new technology, fresh paint. But when he walked in, everything felt the same. The window still caught the morning sun. The air still held that faint scent of chalk and paper. And seat 17, it was still there. The principal had made sure it stayed untouched, a quiet tribute. Some students even left small notes on that desk at the end of the year, messages of gratitude, good wishes, or dreams for the future. None of them really knew why they did it. They just felt like it was the right thing to do. One spring afternoon, Mr. Daniel stood by that seat again, running his hand gently along its surface. He thought about how one paper had changed his life, not because it was mysterious, but because it reminded him that love, effort, and memory have a power that outlasts everything else. He whispered softly, "Thank you for reminding me what this was all for." As he turned to leave, a soft breeze moved through the open window, flipping one of the students' notebooks open on a desk nearby. The page turned to a short paragraph written in neat handwriting. It said, "Stories never die. They just find new readers." He stopped and smiled. Maybe one of his students had written it as part of an assignment. Or maybe, once again, something beyond explanation had found a way to speak. He didn't need to know which. He just closed the notebook gently and whispered, "I hear you." Outside, the schoolyard was full of life, children running, shouting, laughing. The sound filled the air like music. Mr. Daniel stood there for a long moment watching them. He felt peaceful, The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've done what you were meant to do. As he finally walked away from the building for the last time, the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting a warm glow across the classroom windows. In that golden light for just a heartbeat, it looked as if someone was sitting by the window, a boy with a blue pen in hand, smiling softly, and then the light shifted, and the window was empty again. But the story, their story, stayed. In the papers, in the lessons, in the lives that had been touched, because some connections don't end. They simply change form, and somewhere beyond what the eye can see, a teacher and his student remained part of the same story, one that would keep being told in classrooms and memories, and in quiet hearts for years to come. Years had passed since Mr. Daniel first found the mysterious test paper. The school had changed, new students, new teachers, new technology. Yet whenever he visited, the room where Liam had once sat felt alive in a way no renovation could ever erase. Now retired, Mr. Daniel spent his days writing. Not textbooks or lesson plans, but letters, journals, and essays. He wrote about teaching, about learning, and about the strange, unexplainable moments that had taught him more than any formal lesson ever could. Some of his writings he shared with schools and educational forums. Some he kept private, meant only for himself and the memory of his students. One crisp autumn morning he received a package in the mail. It was unmarked except for a faint scrawl in blue ink that made his chest tighten. "For you, sir." Inside was a small, carefully wrapped notebook. The handwriting was unmistakable. His hands trembled as he opened it. Each page was filled with words, sketches, and stories, all by Liam. Somehow, over the years, this notebook had found its way to him. He didn't question how. He simply read. The stories were simple at first. Memories of school days, dreams of traveling, thoughts about books and writing. But as he flipped through the pages, a deeper message emerged. Liam had written about courage, kindness, and hope. He had written about the people who shaped his life, about the moments that mattered, and about how he wanted to leave something behind, something that would make others feel remembered. One entry stood out more than the others. It read, "I know I won't be here to see everything, but if someone remembers me, then my story continues. And if my story continues, maybe someone else's will too. That's how we live forever, not in our bodies, but in the hearts we touch." Mr. Daniel held the notebook to his chest and whispered, "You were right, Liam, you do live on." Inspired by the notebook, he decided to honor Liam's legacy in a way that could reach countless students. He began creating a series of lessons and storytelling sessions that emphasized empathy, kindness, and creativity, teaching students not just to pass exams, but to live with curiosity and heart. He incorporated Liam's words, sometimes reading directly from the notebook, and sometimes letting the messages inspire discussions about life, choices, and memory. Soon his sessions became popular across multiple schools. Teachers and students alike would speak of the mysterious boy whose words had touched their hearts. Many wondered if Liam had somehow reached across time to guide them. Mr. Daniel never confirmed it. He simply smiled quietly, knowing the truth wasn't important. The lesson itself was. One afternoon, while visiting his old classroom one last time before the winter holidays, he noticed something unexpected. On seat 17, someone had left a folded piece of paper. Curious, he picked it up. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. It read, "Thank you for believing in us even when we couldn't see it. You helped us finish our own stories." He felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't from Liam this time. It was from all the students who had come after him. Students inspired by his teachings and indirectly by Liam. The circle had expanded. The story that began with a single paper had grown into something far larger than he had imagined. As he looked around the room, he realized the truth. Teaching was never about the moment alone. It was about the ripple. One act of attention, one note of encouragement, one story remembered. It could travel farther than anyone expected. He walked to the window by seat 17 and looked out at the schoolyard. The trees swayed gently, and the late autumn sun shone through the branches. For a moment, he thought he saw a faint outline of a boy sitting there, smiling softly, pen in hand, and in that moment he didn't feel surprised or fearful. He felt grateful. Mr. Daniel closed the classroom door behind him and turned toward the school's exit. His steps were slow, steady, confident. Every corner of the building held memories, laughter, lessons, questions, answers, and now, something magical that had taught him about the invisible threads connecting life, learning, and love. When he reached home, he placed Liam's notebook beside the framed test paper. He sat down with a cup of tea and allowed himself to reflect. He realized that part of teaching was learning, and part of learning was remembering. Some lessons weren't found in textbooks. They were found in quiet gestures, in small connections, in the courage of a student to be remembered and a teacher to remember. He wrote in his journal that night, "We are never truly gone. Every kind word, every lesson, every story continues to grow in ways we cannot always see. And those who touch our hearts remain there forever." The next morning, he decided to do something he had never done before. He sent copies of Liam's stories, along with his own reflections, to every school in the district. He included a note: "Stories never die when they are remembered. Teach with heart, listen with attention, and never underestimate the power of a student's words." Soon, teachers began writing back, sharing their own stories of students who had left an impression, students who had gone too soon, or moments that had changed the course of a life. Mr. Daniel read each letter carefully, realizing that the ripple Liam had started was only growing. Years later, as Mr. Daniel walked through the same school corridors, now empty and silent at the end of a day, he paused by seat 17. He smiled, tracing a finger along the desk. The memories were vivid yet comforting. He whispered softly, as if speaking to Liam himself, "Your story has changed more lives than we could have ever imagined." Outside, the sunset cast a golden glow on the building. A gentle wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the quiet energy of every student who had ever learned, laughed, or grown under his guidance. And for a brief, perfect moment, it felt as if a boy with a blue pen in hand was smiling by the window, watching it all unfold. Mr. Daniel walked away, leaving the classroom bathed in sunlight. He knew that the stories, the lessons, and the memories would continue, carried forward in every student who learned, every teacher who listened, and every heart that remembered. In the end, he understood the greatest truth of all, that some connections never end. They ripple outward, invisible yet unstoppable, leaving traces of hope, courage, and love in every life they touch. And in that understanding, he found a peace deeper than anything he had ever known. The test paper, the notebook, the unfinished essay, they were more than objects. They were reminders that life itself is a story, one that can be continued, one that can inspire, one that can teach, even from beyond what we can see. And with that, he smiled quietly to himself, feeling the warmth of a story finished and yet still growing.